Good afternoon, good evening. I'm KIRILL GERSTEIN, and you have tuned into the online seminar that I host at the Hanns Eisler Musik Hochschule in Berlin, KIRILL GERSTEIN Invites. And it's a thrill to be able to welcome Ian Bostridge to this online platform. We're in a virtual space, but it's wonderful that we can all be in some way together, and this may come up. You just listened to the first song, the opening of the Winterreise cycle in the recording with Ian Bostridge. I believe it's his most recent one, with composer Thomas Addes playing the piano, and Tom was a guest with us a couple of weeks ago. And I think this is a great way to open a conversation with Ian, who has performed the cycle over 100 times, I believe, and has written a wonderful book that either you know or will know after this seminar, An Anatomy of Obsession, Schubert's Winter Journey. And just a word to say, I think we all know Ian and his wonderful art. I think it's wonderful that his a large component of his intellectual life is that of a scholar, in addition to being a performer. And he has a degree in history and philosophy. And I won't be able to resist asking him about his book on witchcraft. That might come later as well. And you're very welcome to post questions, and I will try to get to them in some order that makes sense, but definitely share your thoughts, ask questions, and great to have you with us, Ian. Welcome.
Nice to be here. It's very disconcerting listening to oneself. I mean, you probably know it's very disconcerting probably to listen to yourself playing the piano. It's extra disconcerting to listen to singing. I think it's a bit like when you first hear your voice on the, I don't know, when I first had my speaking voice, or you never really get over the thing of hearing everything that's wrong. It's like going back to the editing suite and thinking, oh God, I wish I'd changed that bar, or I'd changed, anyway. This piece is an extraordinary piece because it's massive. To start with, it's massive. It's an hour and 10 minutes long. I remember when I performed it with a long time ago, and I made a recording with Leif Ove Ansnes. He said it was the longest he ever spent without getting up at the piano. Not quite as long as Igor Levit playing that piece by Satie, which he just did, but he did get up, but that's 23 hours or 24 hours. But I think it's massive, but it also stands right at the beginning of the Lied as a great art form. Of course, there's always been song, and there are great song traditions in all musical traditions. And if I think of the Western European tradition, you can think of the lute song tradition in the 16th and 17th century as being a sort of parallel. Again, songs about love, songs which are quite technically progressive, which are very concentrated on poetry. And so it's not as if this hadn't happened before, but something new did happen at the beginning of the 19th century. I think what happened was partly the influence of Romanticism. So love, which is what most of, or an enormous number of these songs are about, came to be seen as sort of constitutive somehow of human identity. And that's something that's carried on in a somewhat debased form into our own day through I mean, pop music is a way that we as teenagers construct our identities. We sit in our rooms on our own and listen to sad songs about love, and that's what Winterreise is. It's a set of sad songs about love. The other reason is a technical and a material technical reason, which was the development of the technology of the piano. I think so that by developing something quasi orchestral in keyboard playing, I suppose something where there was the possibility of greater depth and richness, and I suppose sustaining is very important. I don't know enough about the piano, but you suddenly had this partnership possible in song. I mean, if you look at Schubert's song of which is, you know, it's about 600, more than 600 songs. A lot of them are very simple strophic songs with what you would call accompaniments, in the same way that, you know, strumming a guitar might be an accompaniment, just a very simple accompaniment and a very simple vocal line. And that was the sort of song that somebody like Goethe liked when people set his poetry to music. But Schubert at the same time did extraordinary things, and he did them very early on. He composed particularly, I think, 2 songs towards the beginning of his career as a composer. One, Gretchen am Spinnrade, which is an extraordinary performance for a teenage composer to write such a deep song about the awakening of sexuality in a young woman, and to represent that through figuration in the piano, which shifts and harmonically and then stops. That's an extraordinary song. And then Erlkönig is the other extraordinary song, I think. And those sorts of songs are really only possible on the piano, probably not on any earlier keyboard instrument. So you get this tradition starting at towards the beginning of the 19th century, but Winterreise happens very early, and it's really it's the greatest, the biggest, the most monumental piece in what becomes a tradition. And it affects the way, I suppose, we respond to all other 19th century songs. When you listen to other songs of Schubert's, you invest them with more than you might have done otherwise, because you know what's possible. Whether the other big song cycle that stands at the beginning of the tradition, I mean big in the sense of influential or big in the sense of great, is An die ferne Geliebte of Beethoven. But that's a totally different thing. That's 12 minutes long, and it forms a sort of compressed whole. It's continuous. It really is a song cycle because it's cyclical. The music from the beginning comes back at the end. Whether either of these 2 pieces have much influence on how people composed song cycles after that, I'm not so sure. If you take the famous song cycles, Dichterliebe, Frauenliebe und Leben of Schumann, they're very, very different. Wolf, another great song composer of the 19th century, didn't write song cycles. He wrote collections of songs, poetic songbooks, I suppose, to represent the character of the poet whom he was setting to music. Brahms wrote a few cycles, maybe they're Schubertian. But anyway, as I say, this is a very dominant piece in the tradition. I've lived at the piece for a long time. I think I first performed it when I was 19, totally for the wrong reasons, because I'd just split up with my girlfriend and I wanted to impress her and her mother. So I invited them both to hear me sing Winterreise, which is a pretty hopeless way of trying to make anybody fall in love with you again. So I learnt it right back then and learnt all the words, which is a big thing to do. And so I've had it in my mind ever since, and I've written a lot about it too. And I've written so much about it that I couldn't really think of anything immediately new to say without having questions. So I thought I would read something that I wrote a while ago about it to get us going, and then we could talk about it. This piece starts with a quotation from Samuel Beckett from The Expelled, which is something he wrote in 1946. When I am abroad in the morning, I go to meet the sun. And in the evening, when I am abroad, I follow it till I am down among the dead. I don't know why I told this story. I could just as well have told another. Perhaps some other time I'll be able to tell another. Living souls, you will see how alike they are. In 1827, Franz Schubert, the Viennese composer, discovered in a magazine 12 new poems by Wilhelm Müller, the Berlin poet. The 2 artists had never met, although Müller did briefly visit Vienna to study modern Greek. Schubert himself never left Austria, never saw the sea, or visited another great city. He'd already set Müller's Liederspiel, Die schöne Müllerin, in 1824. Out of that piece of Müller's ironic piece of rustic naivety, he crafted a tragic narrative of sexual obsession and loss. Müller's poems were subtitled Im Winter zu lesen, to be read in the winter, a bauble to entertain a group of like-minded friends during the dark December months. Schubert, abandoning all Müller's irony and his subtitle, made something more deeply wintry out of the material he came upon. When he discovered Müller's Die Winterreise as it was called, he encountered something more essentially cold and forbidding, dreadful, as the composer himself called it, something actually rather atypical of Müller as a poet. Again, as with Die Schöne Müllerin, the composer remolded. He dropped the definite article, making his Winterreise, rather than Die Winterreise, more stark, abstract, and generalized in the human sense. The other crucial reshaping was accidental, but a happy accident at that. Schubert made very good use of the fact that, having set the 12 poems he came across in the journal Urania, a banned anti-Metternich radical journal, having come across the poems there, 12 of them, he found the same poems, the same 12, but in a different order, embedded in a 24-poem Winterreise of Müller's, which appeared the following year, 1828. So he found more poems. Instead of reordering his original set of 12, breaking it open and inserting the new poems in Müller's order, he retained his first part of 12 songs and then set the missing poems out of sequence. As a result, any residual narrative coherence in Müller's sequence is lost, and a heightened sense of abstraction, alienation, and waywardness is gained, especially in the second half, haphazardly constructed as it is, from leftovers, as it were. Only once does Schubert make a choice, changing, crucially, the position of Mut in the cycle, presumably in order to vary the rhythmic impetus. Mut is a short, vigorous song breaking up what has been rather a slow patch in the song cycle. Schubert corrected the proofs of the final version of Winterreise on his deathbed. The house in which Schubert died in November 1828, in which he made the final version of Winterreise, was close by the Viennese food market. You walk down the street from the bustling Naschmarkt, past retro furniture stores and shops selling old vinyl LPs and hi-fi equipment, to an early 19th century apartment house, 3 stories high. 2 plaques, one 19th century, one 20th, identify the spot. Once inside, you are transported back. Not so much by the museum, which the apartment itself has become, it's too ordered, as by the courtyard and passageways that surround it. It feels as if it hasn't changed much in these nearly 200 years. The flagstones, the brown paintwork, the well down below, the slightly seedy air. No one very important lives here. Thousands of miles west, across the ocean, in a magnificent monument to opulent scholarship, you can call up the manuscript of Winterreise. You can touch the thick paper and see for yourself the heavy scorings out, often a decisive box with cross-hatching. The first ideas and the second, the differing idiosyncratic markings in Schubert's hand, which the business of publication has ironed into a sort of uniformity. Accents that stab, accents that stroke, passages written in haste, passages written more calmly. The Morgan Library in Midtown Manhattan is a world away from the Kettenbrücke Straße in Vienna. The distance somehow represents the strange things that have happened over the past 2 centuries to this very strange work. It has moved from backstreet post-Napoleonic Vienna to the great metropolis of global capitalism. Its first performance by the composer was in a private room. It can now fill the vastness of New York's iconic Carnegie Hall. A lot of writing about Winterreise, a lot of my own thinking and writing about it has been historical and contextual. Who were Schubert's circle? What sort of people were they? Where did they fit into Viennese life in the 1820s? What did the repression of Metternich's Vienna in the wake of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars do to them? How did they conduct their friendships and their love affairs? What did it mean to live in the constant fear of death by infectious disease in an age before the discovery of the microbe. What did religion really mean for these men and women in a period where a lot of the material intellectual supports for religious belief were being removed and undermined? These are all issues worth thinking about when preparing to listen to Winterreise. But the issues that now seem more urgent to me concern the modernity of the piece, its embeddedness in 20th century culture, and its continuing meaning for us. While he was writing one of the master texts of philosophy, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, a hammer blow to many 19th century dreams, Ludwig Wittgenstein, brother of the eventually one-handed pianist Paul, was in a typically bizarre scene taking time off to whistle Winterreise to the accompaniment of a close friend. Winterreise was a crucial work for Samuel Beckett, whom I quoted at the beginning of this piece. His hopeless, alienated outcasts, close companions of Schubert's Wanderer. Each of us makes our own Winterreise, always a mark of the imperishable in art. It remains a very open-ended piece, full of interpretative choices to be made, new avenues to be explored, experiments to be tried. Decisions about how to perform Winterreise have to be made. First and foremost, there is the decision to perform it at all. It was not performed as a whole in public until the 1850s, and its very first private performance, possibly a performance indeed of only the first 12 songs, was by Schubert himself, not a professional singer by any means, although he had been a choir boy, and not a professional pianist. A performance which he gave to a circle of his friends. Sometimes a performance to a paying audience can be uncomfortable, almost an invasion of privacy. Maybe it should be uncomfortable. But in the end, I'm convinced that Winterreise, however intimate it may be, is a public work, a theatrical work indeed, betrayed by its construction, one that, written at a time when notions of public and private were the site of dispute, plays with and artfully exploits our unease at the disclosure of intimacy. In this respect, it is at one with much of Schubert's mature work. One thinks of the late piano sonatas, in which coziness abuts ferocity, in which the meditative is suddenly overtaken by a passionate outburst. To move from a grand issue like this to the mundane choices, the technical, ordinary, musicianly choices that one has to make in performing Winterreise, a few details have to be grappled with. In terms of key, Schubert made revisions between the manuscript and the printed versions. So a lot of the original versions are in a high key, which suggests a tenor voice, and those are the keys that I perform when I perform the piece. That's Wasserflute, Rast, Mut, and Der Leiermann. Schubert's reasons for transposing down may often have been rooted in his publisher's anxiety about what singers at home could manage. So publishers tended to want vocal works to avoid top A's, though in fact Vienna may have had lower pitch in the 1820s than the 440 plus that we nowadays have. But anyway, if one thinks the keys are important in a cycle, the higher keys are part of the original conception, and they make a lot of difference sometimes. I mean, with Der Leiermann, the last song of the cycle, it makes an enormous difference if you perform it in B minor, where you have this sudden sense of displacement and being in a different place. It's a much more eerie feeling. So decisions about key are a mixture of, I think, the pragmatic and the aesthetic. Key relationships in Winterreise are to be a part of its architecture. I mean, musicologists will analyze them to death, but there's something there, and I don't think they should be disregarded. At the same time, the tessitura, the vocal sort of home of the piece, fluctuates rather uncomfortably, as happens with a lot of lieder between tenor and high baritone. So it's not certain that it really suits any professional singer particularly well. I mean, this is the big issue here is whether the cycle belongs to tenors or baritones, because so often in my career I've had people saying, well, Winterreise is a baritone piece, but of course no baritone sings or can sing Winterreise in all of its original keys. Tenors have the luxury of being able to go back to those original high keys. And then also, some of the songs are a bit low for a tenor, but they can just about manage them. I think the reason that people think Winterreise is a baritone or a bass key is partly because of two very famous recordings. First of all, the recording by Hans Hotter, which he made in the wake of Second World War, and then the huge dominance of Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, who did early on in his career sing them in pretty much all the high keys, but not absolutely all of them. I think it's not only about the singers who've sung it, it's also about an idea that the work is a dark work. And you feel that particularly, I think, with the recording by Hans Hotter, who sings it in a very, very slow and gloomy way. But I think one of the crucial things about Winterreise, and it's one of the things that differentiates it from Schubert's treatment of the poems of Wilhelm Müller in Die schöne Müllerin, is that it's a work full of irony. It's full of irony, defiance, bitterness, gallows humor. It's not an old man's work. That's another thing you hear very often. There's a famous interview around the time of a famous recording that was made by Peter Pears and Benjamin Britten, and Peter Pears says, "This is an old man's work, and I didn't feel comfortable about doing this until I was in my 50s." And the great German tenor Peter Schreier said much the same thing. But of course, if you want to say what age group does it belong to, which is not something I'd want to do, it's a young man's work. It was written by a man who died when he was 31, and the poems are written by a man who died when he was 34. Doesn't mean that old people can't sing it too, but it's not Vier Ernste Gesänge. Well, I think there are two more technical textual issues. One of them is something that you can get really obsessed by. I'm not very obsessed by it. I want to be practical and pragmatic about it. But the rhythm of the piano's first phrase in the sixth song, Wasserflut, is something that's caused a lot of trouble. I wrote about it when I wrote a book about the piece, because I basically it's whether you should assimilate a triplet to a dotted quaver and a semiquaver, or whether you should make them pull against each other. And Alfred Brandl has written about it and came to a concert I gave at the piece at the Wigmore Hall. And when we did the thing he didn't want, he sort of shook his head and pointed to the score. And so it was something he was very agitated about. For me, it's he calls it a Brahmsian polyrhythm. There's been actually an enormous amount of musicological research about it, and it's not clear that it is a Brahmsian polyrhythm. It's no one's really just no. I think the jury is out, but it doesn't really matter. You do what you like in the end, don't you? As a musician, I think you form yourself as well as you can, and then you do what makes expressive sense to you. Trial and error, and it seems to be, to me, a recapitulation of the rhythm that ends the previous song. So there's a sort of thematic connection. I think the other issue there is that we have these texts. The thing about Western European tradition that distinguishes it from all other musical traditions is that it's written down. And because it's written down, we've developed this idea of fidelity to, or partly fidelity to the written text, and then fidelity to some sort of ideal text in the sky, rather than the notion that the text is a set of instructions for creating something, and that the performers have to interpret and have to bring to bear what they want to do. And you'll find that all the time in most performances, and you'll find, so as I think we all know, performances in which people even change things. A terrible thing. They change things that composers have done. They decide that a dynamic doesn't actually work, and they change the dynamic. They try their best, and maybe they find something else in the end. Winterreise was not the first great song cycle, as I've said. Beethoven's Die Ferne Geliebte and Schubert's own Die schöne Müllerin precede it, but it is the work that definitively placed the Lied at the centre of the great musical tradition. In terms of sheer length, it's prodigious, and its lack of formal unity, in which it is distinguished from Die Ferne Geliebte, was surely an example to the fragmentary aesthetic of the musical romantics. At the same time, the long strophic sequences of Die Schöne Müllerin with their naive folkloric element are replaced by far more use of through composition. Even a song such as Lindenbaum, probably the most famous song in the cycle, one which plays a crucial role in Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain, a song which is so often extracted from the cycle or even sung in unison as a folk song. Even that song is a sophisticated play on memory, using rhythm and modulation to evoke the moods and tenses of the poem. And it is bound together with its predecessor song, Erstarrung, by a common motif, transformed as between the last bar of the one and the first bar of the other, but still recognizable. Throughout the cycle, fragmentary echoes and reminiscences evoke a mind full of regret, but still pulsing with life, often solipsistic, but at the same time alert to the external world and to the play of verbal meaning and musical gesture. This is Winterreise's genius, and the reason it speaks to us now as it spoke to the generation of its creator. So now.
And now, bravo, bravo, Ian. And I must say, well, the excerpt you've read now, and especially the book, is really seems to be not only a guide to Winterreise to me, but also sort of a roadmap of how one ideally should be involved in interpreting a grand piece, because reading your book, there are so many connections and layers of history and human issues that you bring, that I think make the performance such a rich thing. And I think one of the first question I want to ask you about, and perhaps like all questions, it doesn't truly have an answer, but so we come to hear the Winterreise and we feel the richness of your experience in it, and yet it seems like a magical transference that one feels but doesn't necessarily know all the things that you experience and think about the piece. And I wonder how that feels to you.
I think it is a very mysterious process, because of course any piece of music is in the end not something on a page or in the musical ether. It's a communication between the performer who brings something to the audience, and the audience's experiences are going to contribute as much, if not more, to their experience of the piece. So it's how one creates, I mean, what form of communication it is very odd, because it's music, so it's words, of course, there are words, but the words often pull against the music, and it's not very difficult, it's not very easy to pin down, I think, what's going on. I mean, when I wrote this book about it, in which I think what I was really trying to do was to bring the piece alive for people who didn't know it, and try and show them that it was an interesting piece, and that it connected to lots of other things, and that it was worth paying attention to in the same way that, I don't know, Shakespeare or Keats or Michelangelo, or particularly because it's probably not the same in other places, but particularly because in British cultural life, classical music has sort of slightly receded as something that people take. I mean, it's a good thing in a way. They don't feel they have to kowtow to it or genuflect to it, or it's something that has to be argued for. Whereas that's not the case with, I think, with literary culture or visual culture. The fact that pop music is taken as seriously as it is seems it's a strange development in a way, to me. Yeah, sorry, I've slightly lost my thread.
And do you have an explanation for yourself why this is happening to classical music and not to visual art, other art forms, and non-classical music, as terrible as the classical music term is?
No, there are sort of obvious reasons for. I mean, in the visual arts, there's a sort of, it's not exactly commodification but it's the fact that there's an object that is priced and sold and passed on, and there's a sort of fascination with that. So the thing that gets reported in the newspaper most often about works of modern art is how much they sold for, and that's an endless subject of fascination, especially if there seems to be a very great gulf between the skill manifested in making the piece of art and the piece of art itself. That creates a lot of fascination. With literature, I mean, I just don't think in literature anybody, I don't think somebody writing for The Guardian or the TLS would expend as much intellectual energy analysing 50 Shades of Grey as they would a novel by Sally Rooney. But whereas in music, there is this strange thing where pop music is, a lot of the writing of about pop music seems to me very pretentious, because the music is intended to be, it's there for particular reasons, and I don't know. Again, it's something to do with the nature of capitalism at this particular moment, I suppose. But I don't know. I'm probably being a bit fuddy-duddy, and I don't know enough about pop music, and I don't know enough to feel how it doesn't seem to me to be at the cutting edge of music as a field of knowledge. That's all I'd say, I suppose. I mean, maybe I say that because I actually have very little knowledge of music as a field of knowledge. I have very little theoretical knowledge of music, but it seems to me it's not at the outer edge of innovation in the creation of new musical forms. I mean, something Sting has said, almost all pop music is in 4/4. Not all of it, but it's not the most interesting music. It's not the most interesting musical stuff in terms of its musical substance, I suppose.
Yes, and these are such deep issues that we're drifting or are provoked by Winterreise, which is sort of the point, and also the point of the book. And I guess one of the questions that I also wanted to ask you, when you speak about Lindenbaum and how that became also part of the German folklore in its transformed version, what do you think about the correlations between first of all, between, let's say, Schubert and folk music, but also the correlations between the Austrian German folk music and, let's say, Schubert and Beethoven, and then, let's say, Hungarian music and Bartok, where it seems that the very rich traditions of, let's say, the Viennese school correlate to not very complicated pop music of its time. And,
yes.
And when you sort of go towards the Balkans, you have Bulgarian peasants singing in 11/8 or whatever else.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. And I mean, obviously, in the Viennese tradition, that sort of popular music gave a great big sort of fillip to what people were doing, and it added a sort of a different. I mean, there are so many different strands going into Austro-German music. But, I mean, there's the popular side, and then there's the religious side, and you find that even in a cycle like Winterreise, which is, terribly simple in many ways, but it reflects both simple popular music, but also sort of aspects of slight mockery of gestures from church music, because it's about, it's mocking in some ways religious longings, I suppose. There are cadences at the ends of songs which are very quasi-ecclesiastical, I think. So yeah, I mean, you're right that popular music has a lot of complexity. That sort of popular music has a lot of complexity. One of the things that seems to have disappeared as between Vienna 1820 and now is the sort of interpenetration of forms. I mean, you had Tom Adès on recently, and he's obviously used pop music as an inspiration for some of his pieces, but whether it goes the other way, which I think it did in the 60s, I don't know. that was an interesting part.
Yes, and there's a question, there's several questions from Hessel Vredeveld, I hope I pronounce it correctly. If I don't, I apologize. About the keys in which to perform the Winterreise. Do you have an idea about how important the relationship between keys throughout the cycle might have been for Schubert, and to what extent can we compromise on this to make the whole cycle performable, especially for a baritone? And maybe to add to this, I wanted to ask you, since you speak about the keys within the cycle, do you think these were feelings about keys that are relatively stable for Schubert? Let's say keys where he's more joyous or more longing or more frozen or whatever, that you observe in other songs as well. So does this hold somewhat true across Schubert's song output generally, or is it more a localized hierarchy of tonalities in Winterreise?
I think when he wrote the piece, he definitely had some sort of tonal scheme in mind, because he's, I mean, even in the most basic sense, he starts and finishes the original song cycle of 12 songs in the same key. And when he opened it out to make it into a 24 song cycle, he changed the key of the 12th song in order not to achieve that closure, so that he, you know. And I think there are, if you look at, I can't think specifically, but I know that you know, particular keys in Schubert are particular associated with particular emotions, and that works in Winterreise. But at the same time, he was incredibly pragmatic about the business of key, and he would very happily change the keys of songs in order to allow particular people to sing them. So I feel very happy to hear Winterreise sung by a baritone or a mezzo soprano, and to be heard in all sorts of different, to be sung by a bass, although that pushes, you know, if you heard someone like wonderful like Thomas Klasfeld sing Winterreise, that pushes the piano part an awfully long way down the piano and changes the nature of the sound of the piece in quite a radical way. But at the same time, what I don't want, it comes from a sort of slight defensiveness that I'm always being told it's a baritone cycle, whereas in fact it's a tenor cycle. So it is, you know, we do own it really. There are other issues about transposition. You have to choose. Sometimes a key is in a tessitura that's difficult to sit. Sorry, a song is in a key which makes the tessitura difficult, and you have to maintain that sense of struggle. Maybe it's very easy if you're transposing songs down as a baritone to make them a bit too easy, and to lose a sense of struggle or something. So that's something one needs to be aware of.
And to the latter part of my question, do you find some of the keys versus moods, or connections of keys and moods, do you think these are local to Winterreise, or do you find that some do hold steady across the different songs with Schubert, whatever, the key of D minor and the Gute Nacht and the sort of the departure?
Yes, I mean, I can't think specifically because I'm not very good on keys, but I think there are, if you look at groupings of, if you look at a chart of all the songs that Schubert composed in different keys, I think you do see patterns. Yeah. But something like the first song of Winterreise, it's difficult to know really. It's so provisional as a song. It's difficult to know really what's going on and what D minor means for that particular.
And there are a few follow-up questions. There was one that came via email from Marina Haskin, and there's Emily Pegg asking about the recent growth of performances by female voices.
I've lost you.
Do you hear me now? Hello?
Oh, yeah.
You know, female voices singing, Joyce Di Donato. You touched a little bit upon baritone or bass, but if we leave your territory, that it really is a tenor cycle, but what people seem to be interested, what are your feelings, let's say, especially when it's a female voice telling a story that seems to be a male protagonist?
I find that very straightforward to take. I mean, one of my favorite recordings of the piece is by Christina Schäfer. Brigitte Fassbender's recording is, and I don't think you need to see it as gendered in that way. I mean, some people think, oh, well, if you perform it as a woman, then you're performing some sort of trouser role. I don't feel it's like that. And I know when Joyce DiDonato performed it recently, she gave it a sort of framing. She used a framing device of a woman finding a journal written by the lover. So I think that introduces a sort of distance that we don't necessarily need. I don't think the gendering really matters. It's really interesting, the 19th century attitude towards it, because of course we're very used to women singing these cycles, to women singing Dichterliebe or Winterreise, or not so much Die schöne Müllerin, interestingly. But we don't so much hear men singing Frauenliebe und Leben, a song cycle that's about the joys of getting married as a woman, and it has this agenda which we nowadays find quite sexist. But it's really interesting that in the 19th century, the first person to sing Frauenliebe und Leben in total in public was the same person who was the first person to sing Winterreise, a baritone, so whose name I've briefly forgotten, but it will come back to me.
Speaking about first performances and other connective issues, there's a question from Susanne Klingenstein, a professor of literature. Why does memory and remembering play such an extraordinary large role in Schubert's Winterreise? What is it that Schubert was remembering personally or musically? When you were describing Winterreise as a work dealing with remembrance and using irony to reflect remembering, I thought at first, having come in late to your talk, that you were talking about Proust. And I know you do talk about Proust in your book. Any idea when Schubert's Winterreise was first performed in Paris, and would Proust have known it?
I don't know when it was first performed, but it wasn't first performed in total in a concert in German-speaking lands until the 1850s. So I don't imagine it was performed in Paris until, I don't know, the 1870s. And I do imagine Proust would have heard it in the 1880s or 1890s. I think the attitude towards memory is, I mean, the thing in Proust is a very technical thing about physical cues sort of opening up a whole world that's lost. I don't think that's what Winterreise is about. Winterreise is about remembering and using music to summon up memories of the past, I suppose, with regret, and getting stuck in regret and trying to find an escape from regret through the music. I suppose that's what Schubert's doing. So there's a constant tension in Winterreise between sort of wallowing and moving on, which I suppose is something we all have experienced in terms of disappointment. And that's something that it represents very well, I think. But I don't think it's particularly Proust. I don't think it's a particularly Proustian piece in the sense of, I'm trying to think if there are any. I mean, there is the whole business in romantic music of this period of horn calls, and I suppose they're summoning up something, but it's something very inchoate. It's not a specific memory like the Madeleine or whatever, or the flowers at the beginning of Concret. So yeah.
By the way, speaking of performances, first performances in France, it's worth remembering that the German Requiem of Brahms didn't make it across to Paris until around 1930. So these things sometimes do take a long time, not necessarily only to France, but also to France. I was fascinated. So we spoke a little bit about memory, or touched upon memory. Now I was fascinated when you mentioned in one of the early chapters about piano as the unconscious, representing the unconscious, and voice, words representing the conscious, which I found a striking thought generally for voicing the unconscious, so to say, as a pianist, and wanted to ask you to elaborate on that. Is that a feeling that's persistent for you in that particular song, or is that a relationship that you often feel with the piano?
I often feel that. I often feel that because the singer is out there facing the audience, words, melody, it's all very conscious. And then the two things that are going on in the piano are the representation somehow of objective reality. Things in the piano symbolize
the post horn and the chains rustling, the dog
rivers, and of course they don't sound like rivers or dogs barking, but because we hear the words, we know that's what they're supposed to represent, and then we accept that that's what they are, or a horse in our cone or whatever. But then it seems to me that what is representing the unconscious is the sort of is the surging of is what's going on harmonically, and it's the layering seems to me very it's very romantic, and it's part of the origins of Freud's notions of the conscious and the unconscious are very much in romantic literature of the early 19th century and Hoffmann and things like that. And so the fact that it's in it seems an appropriate image for the music, but I feel it very strongly as well. I feel that's what's going on.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, and then I guess as a small follow-up question, I would want to ask you, well, you say they don't sound like these things, but we hear the words, but there are, let's say, pianists that play the chains rustling and the dogs barking in a very, let's say, abstractly musical way of diga 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 diga. And then there are ones that are so more extreme, where the trill is uneven and the three notes upwards sliding are more illustrative. How do you feel about this? Do you feel that we should be trying to be closer to the natural phenomena, or should we be looking at this in a way that we maybe mistakenly would see it, say, in a piano sonata?
I'm always very liberal-minded about things, because I think you have to find different ways of doing it. And as a singer, it's one of the great things about working with different pianists is that different pianists have different ideas of how to do it. I have very often this very strange, it happens to me a lot that when I'm working with a pianist, I'll say, can you make it more expressive? Don't go forward so much, but keep a sort of tension in it. And then I realize that what I'm actually asking for is for somebody to play more metronomically, which is very strange, because I think there's a lot of, especially, I don't know if this is interesting for me talking to you as a pianist, there's a lot of tendency in pianists to, when I work with them doing song, to move forwards. I don't know if that's to do with the nature of the piano as an instrument, or whether it's fashion, but there's often a sort of a leaning forwards rather than a sitting in the box and playing very regularly. And it's funny that I often experience playing regularly as more expressive.
Yeah, well, I guess one answer to that is that there are different ways to play with a metronome, and around that beat. I guess I imagine that partly it's with the fact that the piano is a non-sustaining instrument in some cruel reality, but that can be overcome. But I also think that perhaps it comes with a certain anxiety about the depth of the singer's breath and trying to be supportive.
Well,
That sometimes one thinks that lingering is a sin, and of course the differentiation is the virtue, but perhaps partly it's that, maybe. But then working with different pianists, there's a question from Aslan Cohen. Why did you feel you had to record it again? What differences would you point out between both versions and the partnership with Ansnes and Thomas Ades? So in some way, partly maybe you've hinted that it's working with different pianists that brings out different things, but I think it would be interesting to hear.
Well, I've recorded it now sort of 3 times, because I did a film with Julius Drake, who I've worked with probably most over the past 25 years. and it would be nice to do, in a way, to do a recording with him again, because we've done it so much and it's changed so much. With Leif Ove, we'd done a lot of concerts together, and I think we sort of pulled in different directions. And I was sort of as a singer, I was looking at Schubert as a sort of romantic, and I always wanted to push things in that direction you were just talking about, of pulling it around a bit. Particularly, I think of Irrlicht. Dum 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 da 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 dum da dum. Whereas, of course, what's written is dum 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 da dum. And I think Leif Ove being of a more, at that, I don't know what he's like now, but at that stage being of a more classically minded, he tended much more towards making it regular. And so that was a particular experience of creative tension, I think. Doing it with Tom, again, we'd done a lot of concerts together, and you know, we're really good friends. We've known each other for ages, and we've done it a lot together. And also, he brought a sort of a recreative sort of spirit to it, because I mean, it's a real cliche. It's like, you know, of course, the Britain recording of Winterreise is terribly famous because it's by a composer, and the same with Tom. But it does have, he went back to the manuscript. I mean, I've got a facsimile of the manuscript which I can barely read. It's so unclear. And Tom borrowed it and took it home, and he came back with all sorts of things that aren't in the. There are a couple at least. Anyway,
he found some notes also. No, that.
Yeah, he found some things that Schubert had clearly written and that had been ironed out by the publisher, and which the critical edition, the Bärenreiter critical edition, had not noticed as variant. And they're in the recording, and they're wonderful and fascinating. So
I think
you know,
Tom told me that Mitske approved. No, that she agreed.
Oh, good.
Did she or did she not?
I don't know.
I think Tom said that she did. There are a lot of questions coming in. Hard to choose. Astis Valdimarsdottir, and again, I pardon for my pronunciation, but luckily I'm not a singer. How do you feel about non-singers performing selection of the songs from Winterreise? I should mention string players, viola especially. I'm guessing that Astis might have a friendly relationship to the viola, but what do you think? I guess as a pianist, I could also continue. We have a number of transcriptions, starting with Franz Liszt, of the songs.
Yeah.
What's your feeling about other people touching it without words?
As long as they don't make it really boring and and lacking in you know, agogic emphasis. And I think if you play it as, I don't know, if you play I think the piano transcriptions are different because their Liszt has really, he's changed the piece and turned it into a different thing, and it's fascinating. As with the operatic transcriptions or whatever. But I don't know, I remember hearing some cello versions of Schubert songs, and they were just a bit too just beautiful. And it's not my idea. My idea of Schubert is not, that's not my idea of Schubert. You know, it's this idea of Schubert as a sort of wonderful melodist, and then we hear the lovely tunes with this lovely accompaniment. And it does take something away, I think. But if you can listen to a singer doing it and then assimilate that into the way you're playing, which I suppose is anyway for some people an ideal, that you should imitate singing, then that's great.
Now that we're on,
think of the words when you play.
So now that we are on the subject of words, there are a lot of questions that come to mind, both from the performer's side and from the audience's side. And I guess one of the questions, and that will be more general also for the appreciation and popularity of lieder singing as a genre. So often, obviously, the audiences are not speaking the language of the song, or often, I must say, for example, as a Russian speaker, I can't understand what is being sung in Russian. By the best singers, perhaps, yes, but even by good ones, not necessarily every word. How important do you think is this comprehensibility, and what can be done or should be done? Should there be the expectation that the audience prepares themselves and, let's say, reads Müller's poems at home, or follows it along, subtitles, or just sit there and let the music wash over you? What to do?
I've got various sort of slightly fractured opinions about this, which I don't know if I can fit them all together. But I mean, when I got into this repertoire when I was a teenager, it was through a German teacher at school, and we prepared, and that is a sort of ideal, is that you prepare, because of course, a leader recital is a performance. It's a drama, and so you really want to be looking at the singer's face and what the singer's doing to get the most out of it. I think that's more important than having than all of the words. I mean, I always go back to years and years ago, 30 years ago, I went to a performance of a Chekhov play. I think it was Ivanov by the Marley Theatre of St. Petersburg at the Barbican, and I found it at the beginning. I mean, there were super titles, and I found it really, really boring for the first 20 minutes. And then the super titles broke down. And I started actually paying attention to what was happening on stage. And okay, I don't speak a word of Russian. I didn't, in fact, understand a single word, but it was so much more gripping and thrilling than having this experience of, which is a reading experience. You know, theatre, and a leader recital it's not just a piece of music. It's a piece of theatre. It shouldn't be a reading experience. It should be a theatrical experience. So I think it's David Pountney who said that super titles are theatrical condoms. It's more important to engage with the performance, I think, probably, than to understand every word. In fact, than to understand sometimes any of the words, because it can be quite a fascinating experience to go and listen and try and work out what's going on. And when I first got to know this repertoire, I was listening to Erlkönig, Gerald Moore and Fischer Dieskau on record in a German lesson, and it was probably my very first German lesson. So I didn't speak any German, but I knew what the song was about. Generally, I knew it was about this boy and the father on the horse and blah blah blah. And I found it completely thrilling and the most incredible piece of communication, even though I didn't understand the words. So I think we can, as leader singers, I think it's particularly true because most people who specialize in leader singing their voices tend not to be as gloriously sort of, you know, luxury car expensive voices as big opera singers. So they tend to say, oh well, it's not the voice, it's the words. The words are really, really important. But I think we can emphasize that too much.
And so do you find, well, has it been important for you to actually speak German to engage with the world of Schubert? And do you think, let's say, if you were advising or talking to a young singer, how crucial is it to actually speak the language and possess it, or just know the text of the song and perhaps know well what it means, but not possess the language of the composition?
I have a really strange relationship with German because I'm sort of resolutely, I mean, I'm typically English, lazy about languages because everybody speaks English, sort of resolutely monoglot, shamefully bad at having conversations in foreign languages, but reading French and German and Italian up to a point. But I feel I think you do have to have a very close relationship with the language. And I've sung so much German over the past 30 years. I've listened to so many German singers, I mean, particularly Fischer Dieskau. And I've read so much German poetry. And you do have to have a feel for the language, I think, for the rhythms of it and the beauty of it. And there is also, it has to be said, there is a small advantage to it being a foreign language, which is that it has a sort of talismanic quality, so that words which to German speakers seem very quotidian and ordinary and boring have a sort of magic about them for somebody for whom it's a new and very special language. But for me, it's a magical language. It's not a normal language, I suppose.
And do you find that engaging your audience's response when they are, so that's essentially when you're singing for a German speaking audience, likely in Germany or in Austria, versus singing it to a responsive and well-prepared audience at the Wigmore Hall in London. Do you find that there's a palpable feeling of a different kind of response because they actually do understand the language?
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, I don't really want to say it because I don't want to say, it's not great. Of course, it's great singing to English speaking or French speaking audiences, but if you sing to a German speaking audience, we talk about, Britain talked about the holy triangle between the performer, the audience, and the composer. And we all talk about how much the audience contributes to our performance. I don't know, as a pianist, you're not looking at the audience, but as a singer, you're looking at the audience and you do get something back from them. And when you're singing to a German-speaking audience, my God, there is an incredible connection when you're singing a Lieder recital, because you're doing, and you will discover new things in a way that you won't necessarily discover them singing to a non-German speaking audience, because you will inflect an individual word differently, or you'll find something new in a text, a new meaning, a new emphasis, and that will create a spark between you and the audience, and new things will happen, and it's amazing. Yeah.
And I want to ask you about this, what you mentioned a couple of times now, and also in the book, about this connection to an individual person, to an individual face that you're able to do, especially as a singer, and something that we as pianists are rather sadly far from. Tell me more about it, since
especially doing a piece like Winterreise, where you're impersonating. When I wrote my book, I wanted to talk about the protagonist of Winterreise being whether he was a weirdo or not. I wasn't allowed to use the word weirdo, but he's a strange, he inhabits this strange space between being everyman, he's like all of us, but he's also the strange outsider who we're a bit scared of. So when you are impersonating that person on stage and you're looking out to an audience, you can get into a really strange state of mind. So sometimes I will find somebody in the audience and I will become absolutely convinced that they really hate it, and they're bored, and then I'm trying to convince them, or I'm cross with them, or and that can be, to have an individual to focus on sometimes can be quite helpful. And of course, then they'll come back after the concert and you'll realize that they liked it and it was all fine. But it's amazing what you, as a singer, again, with Alfred Brendel, was really surprised that I noticed he was in the hall, but that time but you do notice people, and I always want, in somewhere like the Wigmore Hall, where it's very intimate and where the lights are on and you can see everybody, I always want to make sure that I find out who's there, because I don't want suddenly to discover somebody there at the wrong moment and be suddenly slightly distracted. I want to be in control of the process. I always used to fantasize that I used to find people in the audience and think, oh God, that's Fischer Dieskau, because it was somebody who looked a bit like Fischer Dieskau. And the idea of singing a recital to Fischer Dieskau would have been so terrifying. But luckily he never came. So. But I did occasionally find people in the audience who looked a bit like him and get a bit worried.
That's funny. And will you spend then, or do you sometimes spend then, let's say, the 70 minutes of Winterreise singing and directing your beam really to that one person, or do you switch? Because that just seems like an incredibly intense experience, potentially.
I've never done it to one. That would be very unfair. But it was very strange. I sang my first concert since the coronavirus madness in Germany last Saturday, so only a couple of days ago. And it's very strange. It was to an audience of about 100 people, so the hall was about half full, which is strange in itself. But it's also strange when people are wearing masks, because you don't quite get the same connection that you'd normally have. You get some connection, but not the same connection. You get eyes, but it's funny that eyes, you can't interpret eyes in the same way without mouth, I think.
Yeah, they go well together. George Revel asks, when speaking on the quote, defiance and bitterness, gallows humor, and sharp irony, how much should we, or the performer themselves for that matter, believe the text presented to us? and I guess more personally to you, how much do you identify, let's say, with Müller's text at all times, and also does that vary at the time of the performance of Winterreise?
I think it's a very believable text. I mean, it's a very human text. It's a very, as I say, it falls between the poles of sort of, it's the weirdo in all of us that, you know, we all have this capacity to become obsessive about things and to fall on to the wrong side of a sort of melancholia. I mean, one of the reasons I called the book Anatomy of an Obsession was a sort of nod to the anatomy of melancholy, because that's what it's really about. It's about falling into a melancholic state and trying to get out of it. So, and as for, I think it does vary enormously. You, as a singer, you bring the experiences of the day or the week or the month to bear on what you do that particular evening. I don't think you detach yourself from that thing. You use your experiences because Winterreise is such a human piece. I mean, it's, you know, obviously, I find myself sometimes always assuming that all music is like that and that all music is romantic and emotional. And of course it isn't. There are lots of pieces of Stravinsky where you wouldn't want to do that at all. That's not what it's about. And lots of other composers too. But I don't think I perform very much music that's like that. And I think when I do perform those composers, maybe I perform them wrong. I mean, I think about, what do I think about? I mean, I'm just relearning a piece by Satie, Socrate, and I think it's supposed to be incredibly detached. And I'm not sure whether I'll achieve that, because I don't really think detachment is something I'm very good at doing. But,
so are you of the school, by the way, it seems so there are two large parties of actors and musicians where some believe that they're so transmitting something that ought to make the audience hot, cold, or moved or shaken, and some believe that they have to feel hot or moved or shaken, and it's their state of engagement that sort of transmits to the audience. Do you feel a particular allegiance, or do you think this is a wrong dichotomy that's often talked about?
I think on the whole, I tend to feel that I get agitated and I transmit that. But I think there will be times where you have to fall back on some sort of technique and not be agitated and still convey the same thing. In the way that, you know, actors, it's very different for singers because we only, you know, we tend to perform no more than every other night. So we tend to have enough emotional energy left to go crazy every other night. But if you're playing Hamlet every night and matinees, I think you have to have nights where you're going to, you know, be detached, but still do the right things to move the audience. But I think at very close quarters, in the Wigmore Hall or the small hall in the Concertgebouw, you know, you feel a visceral connection with the performer, and that's going to take you somewhere else. Unless for me, if it's not burning, it's not really interesting. The performers I'm interested in are ones who are sort of on fire. I'm not really interested in somebody just sort of standing there and giving it and it being very nice. It's got to be totally burning. People like, you know, Janet Baker or Matthias Germer or Alice Coote, or, you know, this sort of intensity is what I need that from those things, I think.
And now that it sounds like a cliche of over 100 times, but so with all the times and years that you've lived with Winterreise or its musical and poetic text, is your feeling so shifting in the sense of, do you still feel that you're singing Schubert's notes and Müller's poetry, or does it sometimes morph into a feeling that you're singing your Winterreise in the sense that that this distinction blurs and you're not singing the piece and, you know, on those 2 pages and those words?
I don't feel a very strong sense of responsibility. I mean, I think it's a very weird thing in classical music that you often listen to these. I'm going to sound very rude. You often listen to. I mean, we're all like this. You listen to people who have enormous egos, musicians, because most musicians do have enormous egos, telling us that they are very humble before the figure of the composer, and all they want to do is realize the composer's divine instructions. I think, heuristically, is that the right word? I think it's very useful that we have the discipline of the text, because otherwise we're lost. But you know, the composer is dead. What matters is that we convey something meaningful to the audience by using, I mean, it's really interesting in all sorts of ways to find out what was done in the past. I mean, one of, you know, we take, for example, the early music movement. It's not, the early music movement isn't good because of some sort of moral feeling that we have to play the music in the way that the composer heard it or something like that. That's ridiculous. It's been really useful because it refreshed the color palette and the rhythmic possibilities and all those sorts of things for a whole load of music that had got a bit stodgy and boring. That's what was wonderful about the early music movement. And I think we need to be a bit more realistic about the importance of, without denying that, of course, we all know also as musicians that there are composers who are geniuses and composers who aren't geniuses, because we can tell the difference when we perform the music. But and Schubert is, you know, is a sublime and extraordinary genius. But at the same time, the performance is very important, I think. And I think there's an increasing movement in musicology to recognise that. I mean, the work of people around Nicholas Cook. I mean, performance has been very underestimated as an important part of what music is, I think, because we've had this Platonic idea of the, you know, what's it called, the museum of imaginary musical objects, you know, that somehow have to be approximated to, as if there's a perfect performance out there. It's a human thing. It's about people. It's about people. Schubert has given me the most amazing material with which to express myself as a performer.
And certainly, I think it's so refreshing to hear you talk, and I think much of it is due to just your entire personality and talent. But I think it's also refreshing that you have not been, and now it might be sacrilegious to say, within the virtual space of a music conservatory, but you have not been put through the process of a traditional conservatory education, and yet there you are able to, first of all, interpret these works so wonderfully, and you bring these other strands of your knowledge, interest, and educations. So could you talk a little bit about your education? I think also your early experiences with these teachers that you say, your German teacher that gave you the love of leader, your music teacher. I think it's fascinating and important to hear these experiences, because the debate on how to set fire to somebody's passion and interest is not solved in education in any branch.
Yeah. I mean, I was very lucky in my junior school. From the age of about 6 to the age of about 13, I had this unbelievably, ridiculously ambitious, I mean, ambitious in terms of what he wanted us to perform, this music teacher. It wasn't a music school, and I didn't learn an instrument, but we did, I don't know, we did operas, we did Bach, we did, I mean, in my last year when I was 12 or 13, I sang Der Hirt auf den Felsen, with, which, you know, was written for the virtuoso coloratura soprano. And I was 12-year-old who could hardly, and then didn't speak German, I could hardly sing, and the clarinet part was played by a boy who was just learning clarinet at school. Not, you know, it wasn't a conservatoire. It wasn't. He didn't. I mean, and it was just that the man loved music, and he filled us with enthusiasm for music. We did Jatze Gott with the trumpeter, and then I went on to another school where the music was not as exciting, but I had a German teacher who was completely obsessed with Lieder and is now a famous, Richard Stokes is a famous sort of Lieder exponent. He's professor of Lied at the Royal Academy of Music in London. But that was, you know, he taught through song. that's as a result, he gave me this relationship to the German language. I mean, we did Lieder, we did the Dreigeilschnupper, we listened to Marlene Dietrich singing, we listened to all sorts of things, but just to get a feel for the rhythm and beauty of the German language, I think. I think with conservators, I think it's just really important that all sorts of different things are brought to bear. I mean, I hope I'm going to be doing some teaching in these places in future years, and I hope to bring, I want people to place what they do in a context, and for it to be part of a more general education. And I think we at the moment, certainly here in the UK, we are fixated on that university education is about getting yourself a better job and earning more money. University education is about educating yourself and having a more fulfilling life as a human being. And a lot of people who go to conservatoire, I don't know if it's true in Germany as much as it is in England, but an enormous number of people won't go on to become musicians. So it should be a great general education. We should be not only learning how to sing trills and play very difficult passage work, and we should be learning about the context of these pieces and what they meant and the time they were written, what they mean to us now. I mean, at the moment I'm working on some lectures I'm going to give next year in Chicago, and I'm trying to look at, political aspects of, I'm looking at the Chanson Mendicas of Ravel, which relate very closely to colonialism and racism, and both in the late 18th century and in the early 20th century, looking at Frauenliebe und Leben in terms of gender politics. I think we need to situate what we do within a broader intellectual cultural context, and but maybe it's I don't have much experience of conservatoire, so that's probably happening already.
I think one would be relatively optimistic to say that it's happening, at least to a degree that's necessary. But I think, as I said earlier, I think your book is an example of how we as performers should try to engage or emulate to a certain extent within our ability to understand the context that not only enriches but really produce these pieces.
Yeah.
But I think there's great trouble in integrating that into a musical curriculum and really finding, because there's not that many people such as yourself that can provide such context and yet still also link it to performance. And I think the devil in music conservatory sits between all the theoretical and contextual knowledge and actually, getting the sound out, both of which are obviously.
And one of the great things about music, about studying an instrument or voice at a conservatoire, that's very different from going to university and studying history or something, is that, nothing gives. You've got to be, you can't talk your way out of it. There's something very, very concrete that a skill that you have to learn. You have to put the hours in, and you have to really, it's very different from, I don't know, bullshitting your way through a history essay.
Jumping back to that, there was a question earlier that is time to plug it in from also from Emily Pegg. What you said about pop music reminded me of Stoppard's The Real Thing, where one character finds pop music moving one the way that people are supposed to be moved by quote unquote real music. Tying this to what you said about the visual arts, where works of dubious craftsmanship fetch high prices, is your antipathy to pop music related to the apparent lack of craft?
No, and I love pop music.
I thought you might say that. Well, but leaving the word antipathy out of it, but could one zone in on the fact that not all pop music, but is it an issue of craft that somehow also so importantly plays into the perceived aesthetic value and enjoyment that we get out of?
I'm sure there's an enormous amount of craft that goes, there must be, there's an enormous amount of craft that goes into the making of pop music. But what I think it's the writing about, it's the cultural place that's given to pop music, and I think the sort of cultural misunderstanding of what it's about. Somebody who can compare David Bowie to Picasso has got something wrong with their brain, I think. It doesn't have, it was, I think Dr. Johnson said, genius is the infinite capacity to take pains. And one thing you really notice with the really, really great geniuses in literature and music and the visual arts is this capacity not to let go, not to let go, but to go right, rather like you find it in Proust, or you find it in more recently in that
yeah, my Kampf.
Knausgaard, is he called? This not letting go, just keeping going, and I find too often with, I mean, I love pop music, but it's not, the attention lapses, and there's not the integrity or the pursuit right to the very end in the same way, I think. And I don't think the intellectual attention lavished on it is not really, it's not really, I don't know, doesn't make any sense to me.
And speaking about this, so let's say a broader approach, there was a question also earlier from Maggie Garcias. Do you have specific method, I don't know if you'll take issue with the wording, but do you have specific method to combine this deep approach filled with information to the score and the piece, but at the same time keeping the interpretation simple, whatever simple means? But I guess the question can be generalized. How does, in your opinion, all this contextual knowledge then infuse the interpretation or get into the interpretation? So all the things that one knows about that passage or that song or those allusions of that political situation, or do you think it's more just a kind of a general process of osmosis that then it's just filled with more internal meaning for yourself and then that comes out to the audience?
I think it's osmosis and it's feeding the imagination, but it's not, I mean, I wrote the book more to try and draw the audience in a way, to say this is interesting. I mean, some of the things I wrote about in the book have got very little to do with the song at all, but they sort of place the whole piece within a cultural context. But when I perform, I'm not thinking about any of this stuff at all. I'm performing. I'm living as much as I possibly can with intensity, being this person who's partly me and partly not me, I suppose. But it's never, I think, because I had an intellectual upbringing and an intellectual background, people think that I'm an intellectual performer, but I don't think you can really be an intellectual performer. You can prepare all you like, but in the end, you go out and you really live the piece, I suppose. That's what you have to do. You have to absorb as much, you have to learn the piece, you have to absorb the piece. Maybe you learn a lot about the piece to feed your imagination, but once you're out on stage, you're living in the moment, I think.
Yeah, so in some way it is a bit like, well, like what you said about university education, that it's perhaps shouldn't be filled with immediate mercantile goals. That, well, if I read that book, I will sing or play that passage better, but just more of a what will happen and what will ignite.
Yeah. I mean, I think visual things can be really helpful. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I just wrote a piece about Tom Addis for a program book in Hamburg, and I was looking at a lot of the things he said about sort of visual imagery and thinking about, and that's incredibly helpful when performing music, to think about, looking at things from a distance and looking at things close up and colors, and but particularly that thing about, music creates new spaces for us. What's so extraordinary about it is the way it creates new worlds, which are sort of visual worlds created by sound, and that's a very amazing thing to try and create in a performance. I think, to try and create a sense of space. I mean, I often remember, when you're singing a particular song, are you singing it? Are you singing it in the room you're in, or are you creating some wider environment?
Yeah, I think particularly Tom is so full of wonderful visual, allusions generally, but also sort of visual metaphors are very striking with.
Yeah.
But you just reminded me with seeing things from a distance or up close. I remember Alexis Weisenberg, who was obviously a great concert pianist, but also played a lot with some great singers, speaking to me also about sort of camera angles and sort of zoomed out shots and the and the close-ups.
Well, there's a wonderful song by Heine, by Schumann, a setting of Heine's Belsatzer, and you just feel it that the music starts as a long shot because you're looking at the palace from a long way away, and then you zoom in a bit closer and you see the party going on in the palace, and then in like something by Eisenstein, all you've got is his foaming mouth in absolute close-up, and it's there as it's cinematic, totally cinematic.
So while we're not too far away from education, I did tell you I was not going to be able to resist asking, tell us about witchcraft and your book on witchcraft.
Well, I was always interested in, when I was very young, I wanted to be a theoretical physicist, and so I was always interested in science, and I suppose when I stopped wanting to be a theoretical physicist, I wanted to look at the origins of the sort of scientific attitude and the rational attitude, and what it is to be rational, and how historically what we call rationality developed. And one of the main areas in which people became more, in inverted commas, rational around the same time that natural philosophy became science was in the area of witchcraft. So I wanted to look at why was it that in 1580 people could argue against the existence of witchcraft with the same arguments that they came up with in 1720, but that in 1580 nobody accepted those arguments. In 1720 those arguments were accepted. So it's not that the arguments got better. The arguments were pretty much exactly the same. It's something to do with the society in which people were living, to do with religious attitudes and political attitudes, and that's what my book was about. It was about how educated people started to see that they lived in a society where witchcraft didn't make any sense, whereas before it had done. You know, the idea of by witchcraft I mean the idea of individual men and women making a pact with the devil in order to do bad things to other people.
Fascinating. Is that available, by the way? Is that something?
It's available. It's very expensive.
Wow,
it costs about £80.
It's worth it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So one can find it.
Yes. No, it's available. Yeah. It's still in print. I still get about £20 a year royalties. Yeah.
Oh well, you know that's we could have a seminar on royalties or lack thereof. But speaking about the attitudes that changed 1580, 1720, one picks the decade. Jumping to now, which is also an interesting moment of what seems almost a mixture of the scientific and the non-scientific age, where some of the most incredible scientific accomplishments seem to be happening, and at the same time there's still an argument whether you should be wearing a mask in public, and or in close quarters, which seems to be a raging argument and now a political one in America. So with your history background, how do you see the now in that sense, this sort of acceptance and non-acceptance of seemingly rational and seemingly scientific things?
I mean, I see it particularly from a British perspective because we've messed up so badly. And I think one of the reasons we've messed up so badly is that we have in control of what's going on this very odd bunch of people. We've got a prime minister who's a sort of got no focus at all, and I don't think knows anything about science at all. And then we've got his advisor who is obsessed with rooting out from government and the civil service people who studied the humanities at university and filling it with people who are scientists and mathematicians. This person himself, he's called Dominic Cummings, is not a scientist, he's a humanities person, but he has, I think what worries me is that people have this idea of a monolithic science, which is, gives us straight answers, and it's no understanding of there's no understanding of the history of science, or how dangerous science can be, or how to use science, or what the uncertainties of science are. Science has become rather monolithic, and it's led actually to a lot of mistakes being made because people haven't thought about the uncertainties of it all, I think. So that worries me in the context here. More generally, it worries the sort of the prevalence of pseudoscience is a bit worrying. I mean, in America, the anti-vaxxers and all that sort of thing is very worrying.
As a man, but it seems fascinating, and probably this will be easier to see from a historical distance. But it seems fascinating, this dichotomy of the scientific accomplishment and the aversion to expertise of any kind.
Yeah.
Certain
yeah.
quarters, and in some way, classical music falls into that category because you have to be relatively expert at singing Winterreise or playing a Paganini concerto to actually do it. But there seems to be a general is too harsh of a word, but there seems to be a widespread aversion to expertise.
And stuff that's difficult.
What do you think is what is that a reaction to, in your opinion? Because it's almost like the experts and the scientists often are the new witches.
Yeah, I suppose it's a this feeling that people don't feel in control of their own lives, so they feel. I mean, since 2008, I don't know. I feel it's difficult to. I don't think people don't feel connected with the elites, and they don't even like the term the elites. I mean, historically people are always going to be governed by elites. So I think that's. I mean, historically also, I think it's very good to be historical in this particular period of world history, because we're endlessly being told that what the new normal is going to be, and that everything's going to change and nothing's going to be the same again. And you have to look at it in a much broader historical context, and look at there've been pandemics before, and there will be pandemics again. And I don't even know this stuff about there are more pandemics because we're clearly doing bad things to the earth, but I don't know if that's got much to do with us getting pandemics or not, because there've been pandemics, or there was a big pandemic in my lifetime already in the late 1960s, in which a lot of people died. There was one in the late 1950s, and we just seem to have become very. See, I find it particularly interesting at the moment because I am a left-leaning liberal, and I'm absolutely exasperated at reading The Guardian, and all the people I agree with are the sort of pro-Brexit people. I'm not pro-Brexit, I'm anti-Brexit, but they're all the people who are worrying about us being too risk-averse, all the people who write in the right-wing newspapers in the UK, and in the Telegraph and in the Spectator. We've become very, very, very risk-averse, I think. And that's not to say that we don't need to deal with this problem, but I think it's been very badly mishandled here. I don't think it's been so badly mishandled in other countries. I've been to Germany and I've been to Austria, and things seem to be there's much more of an effort to get things back to normal, I think, than in the UK. The government in the UK is terrified of it being responsible for anyone dying, I think.
And do you think this risk averse, to track back to our turf, do you think this risk averse thinking has also seeped into the kind of musical performances that there are?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know whether it's connected to the other risk, but I mean, certainly, the pressure to get everything right and not to, I mean, it comes partly from recording, as if the worst thing is to make a mistake. But of course, you have to risk making mistakes in order to give an exciting performance, which means you will make mistakes. So,
which is a very useful thing to remember for all of us. And do you think the current situation does it feel to you, now you've done a couple concerts, for you personally, and in your view, do you think this current crisis also for the arts industry will sweep away some of that? And will it be, or does it feel a bit more experimentative for you at the moment?
I don't know enough yet because I haven't done enough. I think I'm still in the phase of being a bit. I'm a bit scared as to what's going to happen. You know, what's going to come back. But I try and look at it in a broader context to feel that actually things will come back and go back to normal quicker than we could possibly imagine. Because already the fact that it's 4 months or 3.5 months since I last sung a concert, and the fact that I could sing a concert, and I'm singing some concerts in July and I'm singing some concerts in August, even if they'll be weird. I don't know if it's affecting. No one's really. I don't think anybody's done anything particularly. I haven't come across anything particularly imaginative about the response to it yet. I mean, all I've come,
which is perhaps an alarming thing, and one that should concern us as much as the pandemic crisis is, are we coming up with interesting responses? And do you find this slew, if not onslaught, of online performances of varying levels of technological and musical quality, have you found much satisfaction in it for yourself as an artist and for yourself as a listener?
Not really. I mean, I enjoyed, I learned some new repertoire with a pianist I work with a lot. And that was nice, but it wasn't, but I mean, we put it, it's an Italian pianist called Saskia Giorgini, and we learned some Respighi separated, but the difference of them actually rehearsing together, it was just like, it's short, you know, it makes you realize how totally inadequate the whole process of doing it online is. And I remember sitting next to Nicholas Heitner, who used to run the National Theatre, at a lunch years ago, and trying to explain to him that how wonderful as the whole business of broadcasting National Theatre productions in cinemas was, you had to be really careful not to give people the impression that it was somehow the same, because it's happened with the Met, I think, up to a point, with the opera. I mean, it's just, it's not the same. It's a totally different thing. Live performance and streamed performances are, there's no comparison in terms of what you're getting, really. And if you want to make a movie, that's different. But filming a performance is deeply, deeply inadequate.
Yes, I must say, with some things that are very good, but I have not yet had a transcendent experience in front of my laptop screen, and I don't think it's the size of the screen that is the.
I mean, I don't. Occasionally, I look at interesting historical archive on YouTube, and you know, I have done in the past, but I haven't looked at loads and loads of performances online, because even before this crisis, because I can't. It's not real.
Yeah. And related to this, also a question from Hessel Vredeveld. In this time of ever developing scientific knowledge, what kind of role do you think music plays in society, and should it play a role or have a specific purpose at all? Can it keep us in touch with our emotions at a time of rationality? And obviously this is a question that I think we all grapple as performers and also consumers of culture, but what do you feel is let's say, returning to the title of our discussion today that you suggested, what and can it be relevant to us today, a cycle like Winterreise? Is it? And then should we be trying to do something about it as let's say, practitioners and performers of it, or we sort of let music, and Winterreise in particular, but music in general, find its way the way things find their way? Tom, I asked Tom a similar question, Tom Addis, and he seemed to say, well, you know, I do what I do. I release these creatures filled with notes into the world, and then, you know, and that's what I have to do, and that's what happens. Do you feel similarly, or do you feel that there's something that you ought to be doing in order to make the thing more relevant to?
Well, I think we all need to do various forms of advocacy, and we all do them. I mean, I feel with Tom, he'd feel very differently if his music wasn't being played as much as it's being played. So, and he says, I remember him saying something to me. I interviewed him ages ago, and he said, you know, classical music sort of in the attic, and it's probably quite nice in the attic. But I think there's a balance to be struck, and we need, you know, we all of us have to. I mean, I remember when I started out, there was an orchestra that sort of tried to make things more relevant by having sort of flashing lights and balloons and stuff, and you need to be true to what you're doing, but you at the same time you need to engage in advocacy for it somehow. But I mean, the work up to a point has to speak for itself, but it also has to have a whole lot of support around it. I remember it's interesting when you do things in the theatre, how much should you explain what you're doing, or how much what you're doing should speak for itself. And there's a sort of resistance to the idea of explaining things, but I think sometimes we do need to explain things and explain why they're good and what's going on. So yeah, I think I think it mustn't be desperately trying to make things relevant, but it's about balancing. I mean, again, with my book about Winterreise, it's about understanding where this piece comes from, so where it comes from, but then understanding how that actually does connect us to it. Because the more you think about the 1820s, the more you realize that we are a product of the 1820s, and that a lot of the way we are is because of things that happened in the 1820s, and that Winterreise helps us in some very difficult to explain way to connect with them. And music does do that. Music, one of the really extraordinary and very difficult things to comprehend or explain or unpick about music is the way that it connects us to the emotional world of previous ages. It's a very extraordinary thing.
Yes, and as performers, we're, or let's say as people that study these and interact with these historical works, we are in this extraordinary position to deal with the thoughts and feelings of somebody that lived 200 years ago on a daily and a very minute and a very intimate basis, which also seems to be a rather magical thing to be involved
No,
with.
I remember that. There's one of my favorite things I quoted in the Winterreise book was from Coetzee, where it's total self-parody, I'm sure. He's describing a sort of version of himself who is he demands to his girlfriend that they make love to the slow movement of Schubert's quintet, because that will give them the feeling of what it was like to make love in 1820 or something. And of course, he's chosen the Schubert quintet completely on purpose because it's the last thing in the world you would possibly imagine. But yeah, it brings an emotional world alive, I think.
And I think Coetzee has some wonderful texts on what constitutes a classic, what makes a classical work, which I think is a concept that we're also grappling with here. But yes, I felt on a lot of pages that you were essentially also pointing to the roots of Romanticism of Eisler Berlin, how so many of these things then led to, in his opinion, to the rise of the dictatorship and Nazi uprising. And so we are very much a part of the Romantic age, which seem to be part of it.
But now we seem to be going through this thing of, you know, reliving it as farce. We've got sort of farcical fascist impulses loosened. It's really extraordinary. I mean, but luckily, I think they're coming to an end.
So you mean it's like a Cliff Notes version of the previous era?
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah. We shall see.
Yeah. Well, I think you've said as far as doing advocacy for art that one feels passionate about, I think your book and your performances and recordings of Winterreise, and not only, really set an incredible example for us to aspire to, and certainly to profit from and to learn from. And to that extent, I want to also thank you very much for agreeing to submit to this virtual experience today, and to talk about something that's 1820s, but something that's very much today, and I think without question does stay relevant through practitioners such as which is yourself. I just wanted to, before I let you go, I wanted to tell everybody about the final seminar this semester, because we'll take a semester break, and next week, at least partially, it will concentrate also on the future, because Ivan Fischer, the great conductor and the music director of the Budapest Festival Orchestra, will join us and talk about the future of symphony orchestra. Will the orchestra exist in the future? Will it be similar to how it is today, or how and whether it will adapt? So I paste the information there. Hopefully everybody can join. The registration link is there, and I want to thank everybody for being with us, for your questions, and again, most especially, a huge thank you to Ian. Stay healthy, and
Thank you.
hope to hear you live and without masks very,
Yeah.
very soon.
Yep.
Take care.